Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, well, this one is going to be a tough one. We're diving into the life and crimes of Darrell Keith Rich. You might know him as the Hilltop Rapist, and really terrorized Redding, California back in the 70s. And to piece this story together, we've been digging through court documents, news articles, and even his Wikipedia page.
Yeah, it's a case that goes way beyond the typical crime spree. You start thinking about nature versus nurture, and could any interventions have actually prevented this whole tragedy?
Right, right. Was Rich always destined for this? Were there missed opportunities maybe to change things? Those court documents, they paint a pretty rough picture of his childhood. Adoption, a domineering mother, struggles in school.
Oh, yeah, and those struggles were deep. He was held back a grade, and they even sent him to a school psychologist. And get this, that psychologist actually predicted Rich could become violent. I mean, it's chilling, yeah, but it also makes you wonder what that psychologist saw that maybe everyone else missed.
That's a great point. So here's this kid struggling academically, raising red flags for a trained professional. And then, at 15, his parents get divorced. On top of that, he starts having suicidal thoughts. Do you think this was the turning point?
It definitely was a major point in his life, for sure. But let's not forget, his childhood was already rocky, potentially even traumatic. When he was 17, he tried to kill himself, shot himself in the chest. And he didn't stop there. He even shot over a police car. Almost like a suicide by cop situation, right?
Wow, that's disturbing. So there were obvious signs, clear signs that Rich was dealing with some serious mental health problems. Was there any intervention after these incidents?
Yeah, so they did a psychiatric evaluation and it confirmed, yeah, he had suicidal tendencies. But here's the thing. It doesn't seem like they did anything else. No therapy, no follow-up, nothing. It's just, it makes you think, what could have been done differently?
It's really hard not to focus on those missed opportunities, knowing what happened later. But the violence? It didn't stop there, did it?
Unfortunately, no. He kept escalating. He was arrested for DUI, road rage, even assault with a tire iron. It's a classic escalation of aggression. And yet somehow the system just kept letting him slip through the cracks.
I'm curious, what kind of interventions were even around back then? Would things have been different, maybe, in today's system?
That's a tough one. I mean, we can speculate how today's interventions might have worked, but every case is unique. It's impossible to know for sure. But one thing's for sure, Rich's behavior was spinning out of control.
And this is all before he became known as the Hilltop Rapist.
Exactly. This is just the beginning of a very dark chapter.
So let's talk about that chapter. Between June and August of 1978, Rich went on a rampage, attacking 9 women and girls. He was targeting young women, girls between 11 and 27 years old, abducting them, raping them, beating them. The fear in Redding, it must have been overwhelming.
Yeah, his early attacks, they were brutal, but it's how the violence escalated with each attack that's truly chilling. Take his first assault. He attacked a 25-year-old woman walking across a bridge, fractured her skull, left her for dead. Thankfully, she survived. But as his crimes continued, his victims, they weren't so lucky.
It seems like the attacks became increasingly more personal, more depraved. Like with Linda Slavic, Rich actually showed her the body of his previous victim before he raped and killed her. He reportedly bragged that her last words were, "Don't do it, don't do it." I mean, what does that tell us about his state of mind?
Ugh, that detail is it's disturbing. Pure sadism, a complete lack of empathy.
This feels like more than random violence. There's a pattern, this chilling escalation. And sadly, it took the murder of 11-year-old Annette Seelix for law enforcement to finally catch a break.
You're right. And here's the thing. Celix's family actually knew Rich. He'd worked for her mother at one point.
He wasn't just some random stranger.
No, he was someone they knew, someone they trusted.
So how did that connection lead to his capture? Was it just a lucky break or something more?
Well, it wasn't just luck. At first, the investigators, they just wanted to talk to Rich because of that connection to Celix's mother. They didn't actually suspect him, not at first.
Okay.
But then, get this, a friend of Rich's, he comes forward, and he says that Rich had shown him a body at the dump. The same dump where they found 2 of the victims.
Oh, wow.
That was the turning point. That was huge for the investigation.
So the pieces start coming together. What happened next?
Well, the police had enough to bring Rich in, for questioning. He agreed to a polygraph, but failed. And as they kept investigating, more and more evidence pointed to him. It was obvious he was lying.
Uh-huh.
And then they found the murder weapon at his mother's house. During a taped interview, Rich, he finally confessed to Celix's murder.
That's incredible how one little detail from a friend can just unravel a whole case. Did Rich confess to the other murders too?
He did. He confessed to everything. It really goes to show even the most careful criminals, they make mistakes. And those mistakes can have massive consequences.
So what happened after the confession? What was the outcome of the trial?
Rich was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. That basically means the murders happened during another felony, like a kidnapping or a rape, or that there were multiple victims.
Yeah, right.
He was also convicted of 1 count of second-degree murder, and a whole bunch of other charges, too.
You know, the details of those crimes, they're just horrific. Judge Hawkins, during sentencing, he talked about these savage attacks on defenseless young women, all sexually ravaged. The brutal methods, the bludgeoning, shooting, even throwing a young girl off a bridge. It's hard to imagine that kind of cruelty.
And the impact on the victims' families is just devastating. Silix's aunt, she talked about how her sister was haunted by her daughter's last moments, curled up in a fetal position. An 11-year-old girl. It's just heartbreaking.
It's a powerful reminder of the trauma these crimes inflict, not just on the victims, but everyone who loved them. And I was reading about the surviving victims, too. They talked about how Rich robbed them of their peace. They live in constant fear, always looking over their shoulder.
Absolutely. The psychological scars, they run deep. It affects their relationships, their sense of safety, their whole outlook on life. It's a heavy burden.
Rich was sentenced to death for 2 of the 4 murders. But there's one more thing we need to talk about before we get to the execution. His marriage. He actually got married while he was waiting for the trial to a woman named Loretta Summers. But the marriage was short-lived. It was annulled just a few months later, after his conviction.
Right, it was. And it was annulled because Summer said she didn't know the extent of Rich's crimes when they got married. The whole situation is just strange. Why would someone marry a man facing those charges?
Yeah, it's a real head-scratcher, but let's move on to the execution itself. Rich was executed on March 15, 2000 at San Quentin.
And he was one of 3 people executed in the U.S. that day. Back then, support for the death penalty was a lot higher than it is now. It shows how much our attitudes towards criminal justice can change over time.
I remember reading that Rich refused his last meal and spent those last hours with spiritual advisors and attorneys. His final word was peace. It's hard to reconcile that with the terror he inflicted on so many. What are your thoughts?
It's tough. There's no easy answer. Some people might see it as genuine remorse. Others might see it as a hollow gesture. We just can't know what he was thinking. But it is interesting that Rich made an unusual request leading up to his execution. He wanted to participate in a sweat lodge ceremony, as part of his Native American heritage.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. What was the purpose of the request?
He said it was necessary for him to purify his spirit before his death. The sweat lodge is a really sacred ritual in many Native American cultures. It's often used for purification, healing, and connecting with the spiritual world.
It sounds like an important part of his spiritual beliefs. Was the request granted?
No, it was denied. The prison officials, they cited security concerns. They said the ceremony would take hours and need things like hot rocks, a shuttle, a rake. They argued that those items could be used as weapons or even to escape.
Yeah, that makes sense from a security perspective. But it must have been disappointing for Rich being denied this important ritual in his final moments.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation. You have the prison's responsibility to keep things safe and orderly, but you also have an individual's right to practice their religion, especially when facing death. It really highlights the challenges of balancing individual rights with institutional security, especially in a case like this, with capital punishment.
This case has been a roller coaster. Troubled childhood, a reign of terror, a controversial execution. I feel like we have more questions than answers.
That's the thing about deep dives, isn't it? They make us face these uncomfortable truths about humanity. We have to grapple with complex ethical dilemmas. Rich's story, it raises questions about mental health and criminal behavior, the effectiveness of our justice system, and the morality of the death penalty.
What really sticks with me is the question of intervention. Could his life have gone differently if he'd gotten the help he needed earlier on?
That's the question, isn't it? But it's hypothetical. We can't really know. But it does show how important it is to recognize and address the warning signs, of potential violence, and to think about the resources that are available to people who are struggling, both back then and now.
It makes you think about what leads to these tragedies. Did the system fail Rich in some way? Could those 9 women have been spared?
Important questions to consider. This isn't just about one man's crimes. It's about understanding the bigger picture, the systemic issues that might have contributed to this.
So where do we go from here? What can we learn from Rich's story? How can we apply those lessons to prevent this from happening again?
That's the million-dollar question. This deep dive, it's not about giving easy answers. It's about encouraging you, the listener, to think critically, wrestle with these complex issues.
We've covered a lot today. Rich's troubled childhood, his descent into violence, the horrible nature of his crimes, his capture, his trial, and the complicated execution. But the story doesn't end there.
Exactly. We need to think about the ripple effects of his actions, the impact on his victims, their families, and the Reading community as a whole. Trauma like that doesn't just vanish. It lingers, it shapes lives, and leaves scars that might never fully heal.
It makes you wonder, how does a community recover from something like that? How do you rebuild trust? How do you feel safe again after something so horrific?
It's a long process, and it takes empathy, understanding, a commitment to creating a safer, more just world. We have to ask ourselves, what can we do differently? How can we make our systems better so we can identify and support those who are struggling? How can we build a culture that chooses compassion and intervention over punishment?
Thinking back on everything we've learned about Darrell Keith Rich, it's hard to shake this feeling of, I don't know, heaviness, his troubled past, the brutality of his crimes, his controversial execution. There's just so much to process.
Yeah, it definitely stays with you. The level of violence, those missed opportunities for intervention, the legal and ethical questions it raises, it really makes you confront some dark aspects of human nature.
One thing I keep coming back to is his request for the sweat lodge ceremony before the execution. I understand the security concerns, but it really makes you think about the place of spirituality, especially when someone's facing that ultimate punishment.
Right. It's such a tricky situation. You've got the prison, they have to maintain order, keep everyone safe, but then you have the individual's right to their spiritual practices, especially when they're confronting death. It really highlights the complexity of capital punishment as a whole.
And it also brings up this idea of cultural sensitivity. It wasn't just some random request, it was deeply rooted in his Native American heritage.
Exactly. It's a tradition that should be respected and understood. It reminds us that even within a system designed for punishment, we need to recognize and accommodate different beliefs and practices.
This whole case has been a real journey. We started with his childhood, his descent into violence, explored the horrific details of those crimes, and grappled with the aftermath of his execution. It's heavy stuff.
And throughout this whole deep dive, we've tried to stick to the facts. Let you, the listener, draw your own conclusions. It's not about judgment or easy answers. It's about encouraging thoughtful reflection and encouraging you to wrestle with these difficult topics.
Because ultimately, that's the power of taking a deep dive, isn't it? We're not just learning the facts of a case. It's about pushing ourselves to think critically, maybe even challenging our own beliefs.
Absolutely. It's about asking the tough questions. What could have been done differently? What can we take away from this? How do we work towards a future where tragedies like this are less likely to happen?
We started off asking if Darrell Keith Rich was always headed down this path, or if there were points where things could have changed. After going through all this, I'm still wondering, what do you think?
It's the question that lingers, isn't it? I don't think there's a simple answer. Maybe the real question is, what can we learn to prevent future tragedies? How can we be more aware of warning signs, support those who are struggling, and create systems that focus on both justice and rehabilitation?
Well said. That brings us back to you, the listener. What are you taking away from all of this? What stuck with you? What questions are you still thinking about?
We've explored the dark side of humanity, the complexities of our justice system, and the long-lasting impact of trauma. But I hope we've also inspired you to think deeper, to engage with these challenging topics, and maybe even find a bit of hope that by facing these issues head-on, we can create a safer, more compassionate world.
We've only just scratched the surface here, but I hope this deep dive has given you something to think about. As always, thanks for joining us on this journey.